Hello, historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. Today we'll be talking about the paper 4 for A-level, European option, Europe in the interwar years 1919 to 1939. This focuses mostly on the rise of the fascist dictators such as Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler, and the interwar years being a period of hope and then ultimately despair, which leads to World War II. Please help your fellow history students find this video by hitting the like button and subscribing. By doing this, it pushes the channel up through the algorithm and we can all get better marks come exam time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the person finding this video because of you appreciates it as well. Now, let's get on to the content and see what happened in the interwar years between 1919 and 1939 in Europe.
This video will be what you need to know for the AL History, Paper 4, European Option on Hitler's Germany from 1929 to 1941. Here is our timeline. Hitler was a politician in the 1920s, but he was an incredibly unsuccessful one. He took part in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, as you learned in IGCSE. It was unsuccessful. Many Nazis were killed. He was arrested and sent to jail. It's not until the Wall Street crash and the downward spiral Germany falls into that Hitler really starts to gain popularity. The second little arrow here is by far the most interesting to me, the legal revolution. This is the terrifying bit. The Nazis come to power legally. They use the Constitution, the weaknesses of the Constitution of the Weimar government, to take over. And it was ultimately more successful than having a violent uprising against the Weimar government. They simply joined the government like a cancer and killed it. 33 to 34, destroying democracy. Once the Nazis are in power, Hitler's in charge of the country. By the fecklessness of many Weimar politicians, he goes about destroying the government, the democracy, within months. In its place is the Nazi state, a race-based state. It is a populist state. It's an ideological state, and was a state that wasn't going to last very long unless Hitler started a gigantic war, which we all know he did in 1939. Why did Hitler gain power in 1933? Again, go back to the Wall Street crash. The collapsing economy in Germany gave the Nazis an opening. It gave extremists an opening. Everybody was abandoning the center, abandoning democracy because it didn't seem like they could fix the problems that the country was facing. Whereas the extremists on both the left and right said they had all the answers. Hitler was peddling, vote for me, I'm the guy that can fix it, even though he had no political experience or governing experience beforehand. And he had a lot of scapegoats to blame, which we'll get into later. One thing you must say about Hitler, he was a fantastic public speaker. He could talk to a crowd and get them whipped up into a frenzy, and was a political technologist in the way that he used airplanes to have political tours to speak to different voting blocks around the country. We'll get into all these things. Through preparation and opportunism, Hitler gained power in 1933. How was Germany governed by Hitler? Well, it wasn't. He did very little governing. He found the day-to-day minutiae of running a country incredibly boring, just like Mussolini did. We talked about that in a previous video. He was spending most of his time fantasizing about building cities that would reach into the clouds, turning Berlin into a capital of a European empire called Germania, and all this kind of nonsense, an 8-year-old boy would really be into if they wanted to be dictator of the world. He left the actual day-to-day running of the country to a group of lunatics that whoever had the most extreme idea was usually the person to carry the day. He would set people against each other and see what they would come up with in order to have them fight each other instead of coming together and collaborating against him. It was chaos, and as mentioned, it couldn't last. The German economy and political system was so rickety by the late 1930s. We'll talk about a guy named Hjalmar Schacht, and the entire edifice was about to come down. They needed to do something because of the trajectory they were on was going to lead to disaster. How effective were Hitler's economic policies? In the very beginning, in 1933, he needs to get people back to work in order to have some political following to keep the people on his side. This is what really destroyed the Weimar government. People were unemployed, angry, couldn't feed their families, and the German public generally just had enough. So rearmament in secret got people back to work, public work spending, things like the Autobahn and Volkswagen, these types of things, and support for small farmers, businesses, things like that we'll get into. How far did society change because of Hitler's regime? To me, radically. Of course, always be able to disagree with me, but I'm going to just give evidence for the radicalization of German society, the degradation of morality in Germany. There was a great German writer at the time named Thomas Mann, and he said, it's a tragedy, the corruption of the German soul by a political madness, by the evil spirit of power, arrogance, and brutality. Germany has fallen into the hands of criminal adventurers, of morally inferior men who have led the country to a state of spiritual and ethical disaster. Why did Hitler gain power from 1933? Problems facing Weimar politicians from 1929. First and foremost, look at the Weimar Constitution. And one thing you need to write in your essays is this thing called Article 48. It basically says you can have emergency powers whenever you want to, which is a self destruct button. Built into the very core of the government. So Article 48, Hitler's going to use, I mean, a lot of the Weimar politicians are going to use it. They're going to set a precedent for Hitler to use. But you need to know that the Weimar Constitution, in and of itself, from the very beginning, was not very good. Growth of support for Nazism after 1929. Many of the Weimar politicians themselves did not believe in democracy. It was it's very disheartening looking back on it. Many of them were monarchists or socialists or far right people. You'd be hard pressed to say that the majority of Weimar Republic politicians were dedicated to representative democracy, which is unfortunate. So when the politicians themselves are so feckless, so lacking of faith in the system themselves, it's going to rub off on the population. The politicians are feckless. I love using the word feckless. It's just, it seems to be the mot du jour, right? The politicians are more concerned with playing their games than actually coming together to save the government. There's going to be elections every 10 months or so. There's no stable governments. They just can't seem to form a coalition. Nobody can agree on anything. And the people are sick of it. So the Nazis and other extremist parties on the right and the communists on the left, they get a ton of votes. We're seeing the fracturing. Whenever democracy is dying, you see the center start to crack and it goes to the extremes, to the opposite poles. And after 1929, there's just a groundswell of people that are fed up and willing to go to extremes, either on the left or the right. Hitler's appointment as chancellor, I'm just going to say some names. You can look them up and see all the twists and turns. Hindenburg, von Papen, Schleicher, and Brüning. Know those names. Consolidation of power, need to know the Reichstag fire and just the not gradual, it was rapid, the rapid erosion of democracy and consolidation into a dictatorship. How was Germany governed by Hitler? Hitler's aims in government and administration, establishing the Nazi state. Basically, there was two positions for the same job. One was held by a government official and the other one by a Nazi party member. So a kind of dualism. Like I said before, Hitler always loved to put two people and pit them against each other. And whoever was the more brutal or more insane, the guy Hitler liked better. So this, of course, leads to an escalation spiral and the destruction of Germany by 1945. But in these early days, Hitler must have thought himself very clever for getting people to fight for his favor. And this led to another thing called working towards the Fuhrer. Nobody really knew what Hitler wanted. He was very vague. It operated on this thing called the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. And he would give out some vague order and say, go do something. And nobody really knew what he meant. So they were just guessing. That's what working towards the Fuhrer meant. Whatever they thought Hitler wanted, that's what they would then do. Gleichschaltung, coordination. It means bringing all aspects of German life under Nazi rule, from childbirth to death and everything in between. Means of control, e.g. use of propaganda and use of terror. Propaganda is split into positive propaganda and negative propaganda. The positive propaganda is how great the Nazis are and we're building all this stuff, and Goebbels is trying to condition the German people into thinking that the Nazi movement is some kind of savior of Germany. The negative propaganda is primarily used against Jews and other groups that the Nazis really despise. They say they're the ones that betrayed Germany in World War I. They're the ones that are exploiting Germany in the interwar years, and we are going to bring them to heel. Goebbels is such a key figure in the Nazi regime. He's one of the most important people in the Nazi regime for sure. You need to know him and his Ministry of Enlightenment. So to use the translator for anything the Nazis say, you just invert it, right? So Goebbels was in charge of this Ministry of Enlightenment, and it was meant to dumb the people down. Terror from using SS, from using the Gestapo, secret police, beating people up in the streets, to actually putting them into concentration camps. There was a wide range of tools that the Nazi government would use to terrorize its citizens. For those citizens that were not enticed by the carrots, they would then use the sticks. Persecution of Jews and other minorities. Here you would look into the actual government acts that strip Jews of their right to work for the government, and then eventually property and citizenship. Look into things like the Nuremberg laws. Einstein, for example, he goes into exile in the early 1930s as the situation in the country gets bleaker and bleaker for anyone who is not an ethnic German. Aims of and developments in foreign policy. Go back to your IGCSE. Breaking the Treaty of Versailles was order number one, so they tried everything they could to dismantle the Treaty of Versailles. And once that is just a shell of itself, we start to see the expansionist tendencies come forward in the Nazi regime. We see the Spanish Civil War. They're testing out their new weapons, getting into things like the remilitarization of the Rhineland inside of Germany, Anschluss, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and then eventually the full-scale hostilities of World War II. How effective were Hitler's economic policies, changing priorities of economic policy? In the beginning of Hitler's regime, it was mainly concentrated on getting people back to work, reducing the massive unemployment that was causing the discontent. As things began to improve, and Hitler got lucky as well with the bottoming out of the world economy in 32, 33, with FDR, doing New Deal policies, and some other countries kind of getting their act together, the UK dropping the gold standard. Not saying it was great time in the 1930s, but the deepest depths of the 1930s Great Depression really coincided with the death of Weimar and a little uptick in stabilization for Europe. So after all of this was done, the goal of rearmament and being able to launch offensive operations in the coming years, that was the main policy. We had people like the Krupp family, look into them. All of the oligarchs in Germany supported Hitler. They wanted contracts from the government. They wanted to make money. They wanted communism to be vanquished in Germany, and Hitler did that, and they were willing to bankroll the Nazi Party. Responses to the Great Depression. In the beginning, it's the Nazi plan to get people back to work. That is the key goal. So massive public works projects get greenlit. Now's a good time to mention Hjalmar Schacht. He's the Nazi finance minister. He's the one who's the architect of getting the money to pay for all this stuff. He uses all kinds of financial trickery, these things called MEFO bills, MEFO. So check those out. This is a legal debt that's not allowed under the Treaty of Versailles. It's a little bit of book cooking. And in the short term, it works. So a lot of economic activity happens in Germany. People are put back to work, and through some fancy accounting, it looks like everything is okay. In the medium to long term, it's not really going to work. The economy is going to overheat. Schlock says we need to cool things off. Hitler says no, and is replaced by eventually Goering, who is not any kind of economist. The responses change with the times as well. So the overarching goal is to get ready for World War II, but in the near term, political support, getting Germany out of the depths of the Depression, stabilization is the key. Then later on, the goalposts change, and it's to get an army, navy, air force ready for World War II. Key policies in agriculture and industry. Like we said, autarky is the goal, so they needed to make enough food to feed themselves. That was a key component of the war strategy. Blood and soil kind of calls for raising agricultural output, some support for small farmers. But if you look at all the money that was distributed to agriculture and industry, the gigantic corporations in Germany really received the lion's share. So Siemens, IG Farben, Krupp Steel, all of these massive conglomerates They were the ones getting big bucks to prepare Germany for war. There was some expansion of arable land being increased and more food being grown, but results were limited at best. Impact of foreign policy on the economy. As stated before, war is what Hitler wants. This is what he's aligning all of his policies towards. And he's remilitarizing and using debt to such an extent the entire economy was going to explode sooner or later. So the Nazis needed to expand, take over other countries, take their resources in order to just keep the train going, basically. So they wanted to take over Austria. They did Anschluss, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the entire strength of the state was focused on rearmament and World War II. And in order to keep the economy going for the country as a whole, they needed that war to happen. How far did society change because of Hitler's regime? Reasons for and impact of policies towards women and children. The first thing you need to do with any questions that deal with society is separate ethnic Germans from minorities. So policies are meant to affect both groups. They're supposed to affect ethnic Germans positively and minorities negatively. Policies towards women, if you're a German woman, you're supposed to have a whole bunch of kids. The more the merrier, right? You get a gold cross if you have 8 or more kids, I believe the number was. Hitler Youth and the League of German Maidens are the names of the two youth organizations. And I really want to make a point here of mentioning this because I think this has really been overlooked in the books and in the course to some extent. It's the importance of pseudoscience in Nazi ideology. So you got to take yourself back to that time period. And Darwin, the 19th century, things that were meant to describe nature are now being used to describe international politics. And Nazism is really rooted in this whole ethos of survival of the fittest. In the Galapagos Islands, it's one thing for evolution to take place. It's a whole nother thing to have this pseudoscience ideology of nations are just like two beetles fighting it out on a rock somewhere. It doesn't work like that at all. So pseudoscience is really at the core of Nazi ideology. Policies towards religion go in two phases as well. Hitler needs the church in the very beginning, and then it's so marginalized when he consolidates power. It isn't much of a threat to him. But the thing you need to know for religion is the Day of Potsdam. That was quite important in early Nazi consolidation of power. Life under the Nazi regime, e.g. standard of living, consumer goods, leisure time. My favorite episode of the original Star Trek series is called Patterns of Force. I'll put a link in the description. It's really a wonderful piece of science fiction. I don't want you to use it as evidence in your essays. Don't do that. But maybe if you're into a bit of creativity and early classic sci-fi, you can watch that episode. Okay, I won't say what it is. I don't want to spoil that episode for you. But the Nazis rebuilt Germany quickly. And the standard of living, consumer goods, leisure time, all this stuff for ethnic Germans was vastly improved in a very short amount of time. People were able to afford a cheap Volkswagen. They had new roads, new airports, housing was being constructed, free movies, free professional sports, free amenities for families. So there were a lot of things that the German people benefited from during the Nazi regime until the Nazi leadership took the country to war and killed millions of them. Level of support for the Nazi regime, no one knows. It was a dictatorship, and any dissent against the government could land you in a concentration camp or get you killed. So there's no right or wrong answer for any type of question about the level of support the Nazi regime has. Just have the evidence. So all the things that were beneficial to the German people, put that on one side of your argument, the things we just mentioned, all the freebies and socialized spending and things like that. On the other hand, all the freedoms that were taken away, all of the inhumane things the Nazis did to the minority groups, the belligerence, the hate, the anti-intellectualism. Many people despised the Nazis during their years in power. To wrap up, the beginning of the Nazi regime, you need to know how Hitler outplayed Hindenburg. Well, he outplayed Hindenburg by living and Hindenburg dying. That was one thing. But people like Brüning, Schleicher, von Papen, those figures who were just no match for Hitler, who were completely outplayed by him, and then dismantling democracy and turning Germany into a fascist dictatorship. Phase 2 is just the chaos that is Nazi Germany, working towards the Fuhrer, meaning there's no set plan. People are implementing policy based on their best guess of what they thought Hitler wanted. And last but not least, we know how this ends. It ends with the destruction of the Nazi Party and Nazi Germany after 6 years of World War II.